Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
In my interview, I interviewed one pastor. He told me that every Sunday when I stood at the pulpit, there were a lot of different peoples. My church is pretty multicultural. I kind of stopped him, and in a kind of unkind word, I replied, I give you that your church is multi-ethnic attending. He wasn't really pleased with my reply. He put down his coffee. What are you talking about? I said, well, I have a different way to look at it. So I said to him, look, when I go to your website, I look at your staff and look at your elders. Out of 17 people, 16 of them are Caucasians. In other words, a lot of Caucasian churches like to have multi-ethnic attending, but they still do church in a very Caucasian way.
My name is Lindsay Calloway, and I'm a researcher at the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. On today's episode, we're speaking with Enoch Wong. Enoch is Assistant Professor and Director of the Centre for Leadership Studies at the Canadian Chinese School of Theology, which is housed at Tyndale University in Toronto. Rick and I speak with Enoch about his latest book, How Am I Going to Grow Up?, which is based on his research exploring the silent exodus of Canadian-born Chinese from their parents' churches. You won't want to miss Enoch's perspective about ethnicity and religiosity, and the role of leadership in shepherding the next generation and pursuing true multicultural worship.
So welcome to Faith Trends, Enoch. Before we start talking about the second generation Chinese evangelicals, I think it's important for us to talk a little bit about Chinese Canadian experience. And I'm wondering if you could just briefly tell us about how Chinese people first came to Canada and about some of the significant pieces of legislation that affected their experience that you mentioned in your book.
Well, it was reported, at least in literature, that the Chinese began to show up in the 1850s on the west coast of Canada, precisely Victoria. They were there for making a living, and primarily because of the gold rush. They actually first showed up on the west coast in the state first, and then gradually they move up to Canada. And then along the way, when the gold rush died down a little bit because of the mere amount of the arrival, the Canadian government decided to recruit them to build the railway. I mean, this is probably something that a lot of people would remember. However, there were two things at a time towards the end of the 19th century became very clear. Number one, because of the increasing presence of the Chinese, the idea, and I'm not saying anything in a negative way, I'm just reciting the history, the idea that there is a yellow pearl showed up. And so in order to combat them, and we all kind of understand a little bit at the time, Canada is absolutely and predominantly white in population, apart from the indigenous Canadian. So in order to kind of curb the process of them coming in, Chinese coming in, they decided to levy a head tax, and it kind of increasingly growing up a little bit. So it actually put a dent on the new arrival. But having said that, those who have already arrived kind of began to settle not only in the west coast, again, for work reason, some of them moved to the east. So we see people in Perry, but also people in Montreal, settling Montreal, and in Toronto as well. The kind of anti-Chinese sentiment, if I can call it that way, was at the fever pitch on 1923, and the Parliament of Canada passed a legislature, and it was kind of coined as the Chinese Exclusionary Act. In essence, it basically prohibits any immigrants, any immigration influx, so long as you're Chinese. There's no Chinese allowed to come to Canada. So you can kind of appreciate that the Chinese population in Canada has dropped significantly because of that. And I believe it was until 1947 the act was repealed. And again, because of that, you can see the migration coming back in.
So this is a really horrible and inhospitable way that Canadians treated Chinese people. How did that affect Chinese Canadians' relationship with the church? Well,
interestingly, ever since the first Chinese arrived in Victoria, Canadian domestic missionaries. When I use the term domestic, it is deliberate because at that time, mission for many of them are about overseas mission. So they saw the need and they began to send domestic worker to kind of minister to the Chinese. And as a result, Chinese churches were built, first organized and led by Canadian. But towards the end of the 19th century, we began to see Chinese minister being the lead. The effect, it's kind of a mixed feeling, if I can call it that way. Number one, they know that as Chinese, not only were they a visible minority, they were the one who's being in some way discriminated because of the act and because of the head tax. But on the other hand, from a social support standpoint, the main society Christian churches have been quite supportive in providing social needs and support, and especially Bible study. Bible study has been a main tool, not only to reach the Chinese, but because of the fact that the Chinese wanted to learn English. So that was quite a tool. That's not a bad thing. So you can see there's a little bit of mixed feeling between the two. Having said that, the Canadian churches also had an interesting motivation as well, because for these missionaries, the pathway to assimilate the Chinese clearly to them was to kind of to Christianize the Chinese, if I can call it that way. So the church, in many ways, was the agency for that purpose. Christianization and Canadianization kind of at that time were inseparable process and constitute the same objective for the missionaries.
Now, there was another very significant change in immigration legislation that came in 1967. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that affected the Chinese church in Canada?
Yeah, so Canada decided to make a significant change in 1967. In a way, I call it to kick the door wide open to accept immigrants around the world. And Canada was actually following the footstep of the policy of the United States because the states did that in 1965. So in essence, before 1967, the immigration policy in Canada was rooted in accepting immigrants based on their race background, especially with a huge preference to Caucasian, white, European descent. However, with the 1967 Immigration Act, it was changed to base on not so much on the country of origins, but your personal backgrounds in terms of your education, your language skill, and your professional competency. The idea is to allow more immigrants to come in to really assist Canadian society when labor shortage was quite obvious at that time. So with that door wide open, and also back to kind of the Asian setting, in the mid-60s, the Cultural Revolution in China was just raging like a big forest of fire. A lot of the people in Hong Kong in particular decided to migrate to Canada. Not only that, anti-Chinese sentiment continued to prevail also in South Asian countries. We talk about Malaysia, in Philippines, in Indonesia, and so on. All these point to an interesting phenomenon, and that is a tremendous influx of Chinese coming to Canada. And among that group, there were a number of interesting cohorts, if I can call it that way. We are talking about ministers coming to Canada. We're talking about youth workers coming to Canada. We're talking about young Christians coming to Canada, but also just basically college students coming to Canada without necessarily of any profession of faith. Once the ministers, as well as the student leaders, as well as the youth leaders settled in the new country, they decided to establish churches. Or on campus, they decided to establish what they call Chinese Christian Fellowship. And through these two agencies, they reach out to their fellow students, their fellow Chinese, and kind of use it as agency to reach out to them. And you can see not only the population of Chinese has increased, and the number of churches and the Chinese Christian population in Canada has also increased quite significantly in the 70s and in the 80s.
Enoch, in your book, you talk about 1967 as really the starting point for the evangelical Chinese church in Canada. You connect that to the changes in the immigration legislation. There have been a number of different waves of immigration. And before we kind of get to kind of the meat of your research, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what those different waves were and why it's important for people to understand these waves and their effect on the Chinese church.
That's a great question, Rick. One of the key concepts in studying sociology, and by the way, my book is basically an intersection of leadership studies and sociology of religion. One of the key concepts of sociology is the idea of homophily. Homophily basically talks about how people get together based on their same background or identical or similar backgrounds, language, cultures, and things like that. Kind of gathering of people with the same mindedness and same background. So when you look at Chinese population, for example, there is an idea that they are all Chinese, just Chinese. But if you kind of look underneath the hood a little bit, we can see a very distinct what we call, or what the scholars would call, sub-ethnicities clearly displayed. So the reason why I bring it up is that while a majority of the immigrants coming to Canada post 1967 all the way to the beginning in the mid-1980s were primarily from Hong Kong. Because of the fact they are from Hong Kong, their language is actually Cantonese. However, those who came in from Singapore, from Malaysia, from Indonesia, and from Taiwan for that matter, were most likely Mandarin speaking. Now, there hasn't been a lot of mainland Chinese at the time, again, for two reasons. Number one, Cultural Revolution, and because of that, there's a great prohibition of allowing people to leave mainland China. To the degree people would leave mainland China, they basically swam across the river, so to speak, and try to smuggle themselves to Hong Kong. And then through Hong Kong, they would come to Canada. But again, we are talking about different groups of people. Although there is still an existing group of people who came earlier, before 1967, they were usually from, there was a very small region in the what we call Guangdong province in southern China. They speak a very different tongue. We call it Toisanhua. It is different from Cantonese. It's different from mainland Chinese or Mandarin for that matter. I say all that is that when people get together, when they congregate, language is a very vital tool. If I speak the same language with you, I tend to congregate in that setting. So you see different groups of people starting different types of churches. Although, again, predominantly at the time, we're talking about Cantonese-speaking churches.
Your research, you said, was sort of an intersection of leadership studies and sociology, and Lindsay's going to kind of pick up the interview in a minute. But in your research, you focused on the leadership quality of foresight. And I was wondering if you could explain to us briefly what foresight is and why you chose to give it that emphasis in your analysis and your research.
That's a great question. So there are two kind of perspectives. Number one, my PhD program is actually leadership studies. So I have to say something about leadership, right? You need to have a framework. But more importantly, at the beginning of the book, I gave an account of the kind of the phenomenon that has been kind of showing up in the late 80s, early 90s, but it's kind of raging across not so much Canada, but actually United States and Canada certainly catching up. The phenomenon of silent exodus, that young people are leaving their ethnic church, the Chinese church, in a mass amount. And when they left, they did not make a big fuss out of it. They didn't want to argue. They didn't want to fight. They just left silently. So silent exodus. And I'm trying to understand what were the major reasons behind it. Culture was a major reason, yes. Ministry practices was a major reason, yes. But we all know that, or at least the way that I see it, as ministers go, so go the church. So anything that happened in the church would have something to do with the leadership practices. And one of the key attributes of leadership, as seldom discussed and seldom talked about, is the understanding and exercise of foresight. And with that concept, because of the kind of the major emphasis at Gonzaga, where I picked up my PhD, was around servant leadership. It is about the biblical servant leadership, all right, but it's also about Greenfield servant leadership. And one of the key things that Greenfield talked about, and no one picked it up even within the servant leadership studies, is his discussion on foresight. And his argument about foresight is the ability to really travel up and down the ladder of looking at things. And he talks about leader must be at once look at far enough and understand what looms ahead, and then come down and begin to exercise leadership capability to prevent it from happening or to address the opportunity. Failing to do that is actually a moral failure, so said Greenleaf. So I'm trying to use that kind of a concept and understand what's going on in the Chinese church. Did they know about it? If so, did they do anything about it? If they did not do anything about it, is it because of their lack of capability, or they simply don't care? So those were the kind of the questions that were kind of hovering in my mind at the time.
So, Enoch, just before I turn this over to Lindsay, just one other question. You've done other research on this topic. Give us some kind of sense of a scale. What percentage of second-generation Chinese evangelicals are leaving Chinese churches?
Unfortunately, we do not have statistical understanding of the phenomenon for two reasons. Number one, even though in my study I was able to gather how many evangelical local born in the Chinese church, and it's quite clear from 2011 census. And we all know that Statistics Canada would collect religiosity factors once every 10 years. So I pretty much look forward to 2021's detailed finding. But unfortunately, there is really no channels to capture how many have actually left and for what reason. My personal guess, I would say 50 to 60% when they grow up, they left. So when I say when they grow up, I'm talking about when they go to university or after they graduate from university, they would leave the Chinese church. And once they left, as my book talked about, they did not necessarily leave their faith. They would go to non-Chinese immigrant churches to find a spiritual home. Although there is still a great amount of the young adults, I kind of call that drop-out cohort. They would basically drop out from faith or church attendance. So unfortunately, I cannot give you an exact number because no one has ever done that. It's not because there's no desire, for example, on my part, because just there's no mechanism to collect the data. And even if data is collected, there is really no confidence, if I can call it that way, in terms of the data collected.
So we're speaking about this silent exodus, and in your research, Enoch, you conducted a variety of interviews with members of this exodus, and you built case studies on these second-generation Chinese Christians who left their immigrant churches. And I'm saying this more for the benefit of our listeners, but you categorized them into 4 categories. You interviewed those who decided to attend independent English-speaking Chinese churches, Pan-Asian churches, multi-ethnic churches, and predominantly Caucasian ones. I would love to hear what were some of these reasons. I think what surprised me was to read how common the reasons were across the case studies, even when they decided to attend quite different churches. So could you speak to what were some of the broad themes that led the second generation attendees to leave their parents' ethnic immigrant church?
Yeah, that's another great question. But before I jump into that, I'd like to bring up an interesting observation. And this is an observation a lot of people, I'm not saying they don't understand, but they don't quite kind of get it when we look at the Canadian phenomenon. In the States, they look at race with a very clear classification. Talk to any people, even the government agency, the way Gallup, Pew Center do research and so on. We are talking about white Americans, black Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, last but not the least, Asian Americans. I bring all these out because the social markers matters. When a young adult in a Chinese American church leave his or her own home church, most likely they would go to an Asian American churches. And again, the social challenges, I don't want to get into the discussion between the black and the whites, the social reconciliation, and that's the kind of the narrative of multi-ethnic church discussion in the States. But in Canada, we don't have that kind of a categorization. Although lately, because of the Black Lives Movement and the other situation coming up, we have different categories, but they are not official categories. So we have people like calling Asian Canadian, people calling, BIPOC. I get it. But the Canadian government, according to the Employment Act, only categorize Canadian in 3 ways. We're talking about Caucasian Canadian, and we all know who they are. We talk about Indigenous Canadian, 64 groups. And then the last one is even funny. They are called visible minorities. And within visible minorities, we're talking about like Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Filipino, like a Vietnamese. Oh, no, not Vietnamese. Vietnamese is actually belongs to a group called Southeast Asian. And then you have South Asian, and you have Southwest Asian, and so on. I bring up all that is because the way the young guys were brought up, they have a different social understanding in terms of their identity marker. So when they go to different churches, 2-3 major things that they really, really think about. Number one, we're talking about those young adults who continue to be strong in their faith. So we're not talking about dropout group. They want to go to church. So what key factors that affect them? I will tell you there are 3. Number one, very importantly, all things being equal, meaning that so long as the church that I go to continues to be evangelical, relationship reigns supreme. One the interviewee told me that faith is actually portable, relationship is not. So when I see Lindsay, whom I grew up with at the church for the last 5-10 years, all of a sudden no longer show up next to me at my home church, I began to wonder, where did she go? And I see a huge phenomena, especially when I did research in Vancouver. One particular multicultural church, we're talking about a great numbers of those Chinese Canadians who actually attended other churches come into that church. And they all said that I come, yeah, pastor is great. Yeah, teaching is great, but I come because of the fact that Rick and Lindsay were there. So that's number one. Number two, when it comes to discussing faith, there is still groups of people who do not feel necessarily comfortable sharing that intimacy with people they don't kind of feel, again, affiliated. And again, going back to the homophily sort of concept, they feel like Chinese have been, their background, and, Rick and I grew up together. We share the same struggle, talking about how our parents treat us and so on. We felt like we're in the same camp. When I share that with my Caucasian friend in a multicultural church or multi-ethnic church, they kind of feel like, I don't know, we never felt that way. My dad always allowed me to watch movie and, did the soccer game and things like that. So one gentleman told me that I could play hockey with my Caucasian friend, but when it comes to faith, I feel like I'm only safe to be with the Chinese. And then, of course, number 3, we're talking about a huge socialization process. What I mean by that is that the way an individual, especially the second generation of immigrants, socialize themselves when he or she grew up. In sociology, there's a term called institutional completeness. What it basically means is that the more ethnic institution that surrounds you, the more likely you would retain your ethnic identity. So socialization would kind of lead them to kind of congregate together and so on and so forth. So that's why I was talking about 4 different groups of churches that they would go to and use them as case studies. Although another interesting phenomenon that surfaced in the study is the idea of who they are. When I asked the question, who are you? Well, what do you mean by who are you? I said, so are you Chinese? Almost all of them said, I'm Chinese. I think there was only one who said he was not. And then, of course, when I changed it to, are you Canadian? Of course, I'm Canadian. So are you Chinese Canadian, Canadian Chinese? Make a long story short, there is still confusion on their part how to live out the hybrid identity because of their different experiences. I remember, I believe she was 26 years old when I interviewed her. She was the assistant manager at the Best Buy in Vancouver. To a person, she said, every time when a non-Chinese came to me, the first question they would ask is, do you speak English? Even though she was born in Vancouver. And then she would say, when I said, yes, I can speak English, some people, not all, some people would deliberately speak very slowly, as if even though you know English, you probably don't know what I'm talking about, so let me slow it down. So those are the kind of oddball experience. I'm not saying it prevails all the time, but again, these are the kind of things that kind of show up from time to time.
Right. And another thing, at least in regards to identity, is so many of your participants would say, I'm a Christian first, and that holds precedence over my ethnic identity. But they still chose to worship in a community that reflected a similar culture value or a shared history. So can you speak to the role of ethnicity in shaping identity and worship preference or ecclesial preference?
Well, in terms of the gathering, as I said earlier, the ethnicity matters in terms of where they get together. But as I said earlier, all things being equal, and that is really the fundamental point, that they would not go to anything that is not evangelical. So they feel like they would not give up their faith identity. So in terms of the intersection between ethnicity, religiosity, it is quite clear the religious identity is considered to be more superior. But again, if you look at the phenomenon from the idea of socialization, that becomes very, very clear that they like to socialize with their own people. Let me give you maybe one example. In Vancouver, more so than in Toronto, there are a number of second gen who started their own church. And so in my category, they are the sort of second generation, Chinese churches, English evangelical. So again, so long as evangelical, we're good to go. Frankly, to a person, all these ministers, when they started their church, they would tell me that their goal was not to simply have a Chinese Canadian second gen church. The goal was to have English-speaking, multi-ethnic, like a Canadian church, a mainline church, or so not mainline, a mainstream church. But again, many leaders would tell you that church continued to be basically a reflection of the product of the socialization of their congregants. So for example, this particular church that I went to, I preached there. I look at their website, we aspire to be multi-ethnic, multicultural. I preached there, I would say about 80 people. There were only 2 or 3 Caucasian there. Most of them are Asian. And I would probably say most of them are Chinese, but again, I could not tell in terms of their ethnic origin. So there are situations like that. Although there are also other churches who started with a good mix of multi-ethnic basic member already. And again, through that, they could be able to bring in different groups of people. So the socialization factor, how they see themselves, how they socialize, how they feel more comfortable with others, kind of in a way shape them and in many ways also restrict them.
Right. And so when you think about this leadership quality of foresight, is there a way, or did you see any sort of pattern in how the leadership can cultivate a culture that promotes multi-ethnicity rather than one particular cultural value? And I know that sort of the makeup of the congregation seems to be such an important factor in that, but how does a leader then try to have the foresight to invite and to welcome a multi-ethnic group of people?
Yeah, so there are 2 groups of people that we need to talk about. Let's talk about the non-Chinese mainstream Canadian churches. Within that, there are actually 2. I would argue that one continues to be very mainstream Caucasian-based. Although in major cities like Toronto and Vancouver, not a whole lot of that would say to you that they are like that. But at the end of the day, it kind of becomes how you measure a multi-ethnic church. A lot of people basically said, I got a lot of different backgrounds, different sort of ethnic groups and coming to attend my church. In my interview, I interviewed one pastor. He told me that every Sunday when I stood at the pulpit, there were a lot of different peoples. My church is pretty multicultural. I kind of stopped him, and in a kind of unkind word, I replied, I give you that your church is multi-ethnic attending. He wasn't really pleased with my reply. He put down his coffee. He was sipping his coffee, put down his coffee. What are you talking about? I said, well, I have a different way to look at it. So I look at it, again, from research standpoint, your leadership composition, the way you deploy your resources, and your decision process as well, your demographic. So I said to him, look, when I go to your website, I look at your staff and look at your elders. Out of 17 people, 16 of them are Caucasians. In other words, a lot of Caucasian churches like to have multi-ethnic attending, but they still do church in a very Caucasian way. So we need to understand what it means to do multi-ethnic church. And part of my literature review, I believe I did give an account of the 3 different models of multi-ethnic church. Again, the assimilator model. In other words, you come and you still do things my way, right? Even though we have that label multi-ethnic, but really it's the way that I do things. And if the leadership are predominantly white, it is white. And then you have the pluralistic. It allows different groups of people to grow, and different types of program based on language, based on culture, based on background. And then, of course, the most ideal way is the syncretistic. You kind of blend everything together, take the best out of everything. So that's the sort of the Caucasian sort of the cohort. But on the immigrant church leadership, I think one of the key things that they need to think about is how do they make their church multicultural friendly, or at the very least ethnic neutral. So I've been promoting in different churches and say, for example, do you have multicultural Sunday that allow different groups of people to come in and join you, and they take part in the worship, they sing songs in their languages. And also you need to think about, and there's a big phenomenon already happening across the country. A lot of the second gen would like to drop the term, the moniker of the name of the church. They like to drop the term Chinese or Taiwanese or Singaporean, whatever, substitute it with community. Now the reality is this, that doesn't matter whether you drop the name or not. When I walk into your church, I can still see a lot of Chinese. So the ambience matters, the language matters, the deliberate, intentional engagement matters. For example, mission engagement is a very important tool to open up the eyes of not only the second generation, but also first generation. And say, let's go do multicultural mission engagement. My understanding, I have another little work called The General Survey of the Chinese Churches in Canada, 2019. Based on that survey, it is indeed a celebration of their devotion to mission, because 80% of the churches, what they call mission fund established. The question mark become, who are they supporting? Is it overseas Chinese diaspora's ministry or multicultural engagement, either at home or abroad? Those are the kind of things that we need to think about. I do not like the conversation of asserting that, for example, only multicultural church is a good church or biblical. I remember distinctively a young elder told me that the only biblical church is multicultural, because that is, not reflection of reality in Indonesia, in China, because when you say biblical, it means it's universal, right? But we need to kind of understand not only the background, but also the trend. So long as there are immigrants coming in, we are talking about the continuous thriving of the immigrant church with one key assumption, and that is that they would remain faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ.
That's great. And I think that's a really great note to maybe bring this to a close. Enoch, is there a place that our listeners can access your research, or can you point them to what they can, if they want to learn more about pursuing multi-ethnicity beyond just having a multi-ethnic attendance? Where are some resources that they can be pointed to?
So that's another great question. I'm not as good as others to have the presence on a multicultural, on a social media platform. How about I provide you with my email address and welcome any personal dialogue
Sure.
on this subject, and I can provide the resources that I have available. As I said, I have written up 2 major reports. And by the way, I'm working through 2 more. One of them is actually about the local born. I call it Obedient to the Call. That project interviewed 40 North American-born full-time Chinese missionaries and really trying to understand their faith journey from the calling to the field. So hopefully I write that one up soon. But in order to reach me, the email address is Enoch Wong, one word, Enoch Wong at ccst.ca. ccst.ca. One more time, Enoch Wong at ccst.ca.
Thank you so much for being with us, Enoch.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
That was such a rich conversation. One of the things I was so struck by is actually how badly Chinese Canadians have been treated. You know, one of the things that Enoch didn't bring up in his conversation was that there was a time when the Canadian government didn't even collect statistics on births, marriages, or I think deaths of Chinese people because they weren't considered people. And it just really grieves me to know, again, that that's part of our history. And we've seen sort of similar ways of treating people with our Indigenous people. And yet they've become such an important and integral part of Canadian society.
And such an integral and important part of, I would say, the Evangelical Church as well. I think scholarship is pointing towards the faithfulness of immigrant communities in sort of maintaining what the gospel is all about. And I think they're going to play an increasingly large role in the fabric of evangelicalism in Canada. What he mentioned toward the end, just about how it seems to be mainly Caucasian churches that are drawing the second generation in, but we really need to be looking at how we can learn from their churches as well. I worry about this maybe unilateral move and how that influences the future of the church.
One thing that in Dr. Wong's work that really struck me as well is just think about how legislation like the immigration changes in 1967, in many ways it created the Chinese Evangelical Church in Canada because it created space for Chinese evangelicals to come to Canada with their own leaders who kind of understood their culture. And sometimes we don't understand how legislation and government policy affects the development of the church. And, you know, there's been a tendency to focus on things like church growth, where we think that it's our efforts within the church and through our programs that we put on that really affect us. But clearly in Chinese Canadian evangelical experience, this was really significant.
Right. And he even mentioned, I think, in the 70s and 80s about how, I think it was on campus especially, they would create these communities that would try to sort of be a place to have that cultural and linguistic commonality. Many churches really were founded to meet the needs of Chinese immigrants, whether you were a believer or not, and then it became an avenue of evangelism as well. I'm curious to know, the need for immigrant ethnic churches seems to still be necessary as new waves of immigrants arrive and they create demand for this kind of exclusive worship community where there is shared language especially. But is there a point where they need to reevaluate their founding mandates for the sake of the subsequent generations? Or is there a role for kind of blessing the second generation in moving them on to something that they need, where the cultural and linguistic fabric of the church is different and their needs have changed?
You know, Enoch talked about the principle of homophily, the idea that you're sort of drawn to people that are like yourselves. And he mentioned that some people suggested that homophily is always wrong. And I wonder if it's more about that our churches should reflect the communities that they're situated in, rather than being about whether we are all the same or we have a vast array of ethnicities represented. It's probably more question about who is in your community and are you preaching the gospel and reaching out to the people that are right there with you. There is so much for us to learn from Enoch, and perhaps we'll have to have him on again sometime.
I think we might.
Thanks for listening. Find out more about the EFC's research at www.theefc.ca/research.